Consider supporting ArchaeoSoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to another Real World Archaeology. In this series we cast an archaeological eye over film, television and other forms of entertainment to explore and understand the balance between entertainment and historical accuracy. For some people, these two concepts are incompatible, essentially at odds with each other. You can't be entertaining and historically accurate, can you? But as far as I'm concerned, there can and should always be a middle ground to be found, bearing in mind both considerations when making a piece of entertainment. Today we're going to be looking at the film Valhalla Rising from 2009, 10 years ago, in fact, a decade. How time flies. And I'd like to start by thanking the YouTuber God's Own Prototype for this opportunity. You see, this is a request in the comments section in the previous episode of Real World Archaeology, the film Alpha. It was suggested that I watch Valhalla Rising, and this is exactly the excuse I've been looking for to finally watch this film. I've owned the DVD essentially for 10 years, but I never got around to watching it. I bought it when I lived in York, and quite appropriately, I was working at the Jorvik Viking Centre. But there was something about the box art, the marketing, the posters, the trailer even, that just slightly put me off. They were emphasising the brutality of the film, crass violence, and I suspect they were trying to draw in a certain home video audience. The movie cost $5.7 million to make, but in its cinematic run only made back $31,000. And I think that they were trying to draw in the gore hounds and the horror nuts and others to try this film as a rental or as a home purchase to try and make back some of that lost revenue. But ironically, that marketing failed with me. I even though I love films like Centurion, and a similar texture would be like Dog Soldiers, that kind of gore. I like those films, but this one utterly put me off. And so this is the perfect excuse to finally sit down and watch it. And once I did watch it, actually the gore and the violence isn't that bad, and it's not really the focus of the film. So ironically, I think the marketing might have drawn in some new eyes and a fresh audience, but also would have disappointed them. So who knows? This film is from the director Nicholas Winding Refn, a Danish director who is known for films that split the audience down the middle. They often have beautiful cinematography and strong visual themes, and they play with the medium of filmmaking very effectively. But they also often come with a certain baggage, a certain intellectual weight to them. Bronson, Driver, Only God Forgives, and Neon Demon are other films made by this director. And this movie itself, Valhalla Rising, has been described as unbearably self-important. It's also been described as Vikings on acid. Now, interestingly, I watched the extras before I watched the film. I wanted to get a sense of the motivation that the director had in making this film. And he said that the film it became an obsession of his. The harder, the more isolated he could make the process of filming it, and the action and the drama, the better. He wanted to go to a place that was untouched, untapped, as it were, by mankind, which in itself is a weird thing to say. It's slightly naive, slightly sort of the sort of thing that only really a director that's slightly lost in his own ideas could say, especially going to the Highlands of Scotland. There's not a single patch of that land that hasn't been touched by any human being ever. But he was after a certain texture, and that certainly comes through in the film. He says that this film is about mythology, and interestingly, he'd never really been interested in making a movie about Vikings. Quote, not really interested in Vikings, but I've always wanted to make this film since I was 17. And that leads me to think that perhaps this film is not really about Vikings at all. I'll come back to this idea at the end of this review, but I think this director had certain themes and notions in mind since he was a teenager, and he's exploring them using the veneer of the early Middle Ages, Iron Age Scandinavia, this kind of thing. He also said that this film is about going into space without going into space, and that's an interesting comment. Again, we'll come back to that. Now, this film starts off in Scotland, not Denmark, even though the director is Danish, and I see in lots of reviews, lots of comments, people talking about this film being set in Denmark or even Norway. It's not. It's set in Scandinavia and Scotland, a place and time that's very specific, between the 8th centuries and sort of the 13th to 15th centuries. The fringes of Scotland had this strong Norse influence, and so did the islands. And that's where the film is set. In fact, the whole film starts out reinforcing this idea of being on the fringes. The text comes up on the screen. In the beginning, there was only man and nature. Interesting. Men came bearing crosses and drove the heathen to the fringes of the earth. And that very much sets the tone. It reinforces this notion of being in a place where people aren't meant to live, being on the fringes, and the reason for that being the clash of culture, the clash of mythology, for example. Now, Mads Mikkelsen is the protagonist in this movie. We come to know him as One Eye, although he has no name. He's actually a mute, in fact. And he is a warrior slave being passed from place to place. And this is where the first good of this film comes in, is that it really effectively demonstrates what it would be like to be owned at this time. And by that I mean specifically as a commodity. Slaves, humanity was cheap, or relatively cheap, and this slave finds himself as a capable warrior being passed from tribal leader to tribal leader or elder, seemingly in regular increments. No one person is allowed to keep him for too long because he's got a particular talent. He finds himself fighting, tied to a pole by the neck. So there's a piece of rope that gives him a certain diameter around that pole, where he fights seemingly other slaves in the mud, and people are betting on the outcome of these fights. A nice little touch as well, again in terms of slaves, is that when one of the leaders or one of the elders loses the bet, it's a slave who passes the money to the person who won the bet. They're not so crass as to handle money themselves. But this film very effectively, immediately communicates what it would be like to be owned. And even the cage that he's being kept in is crude, and it's coming apart at the seams. It's a brutal, barren, and very effective sensation that's created. So I did appreciate that. Actual slavehood is not fun, and would not have been fun at the time. Now this leads to, interestingly enough, the first bad of the film as well. This landscape, this barren mountaintop moorland place with very little vegetation, is also seemingly devoid of any sense of society. These men who are on the hillside, who are betting on fights, the slave in his cage with a boy for a companion who's sort of feeding him, are seemingly separated from everything. You don't see any houses, you don't see any roads, any women. Well, you see some women in a moment, but not society. You don't know where do they live? Are they just here? And this is where this tension between the artistic intent of the director and the historical world that they're creating comes to the fore once more. It works artistically to have these people seemingly just in the landscape, but there's nothing supporting them. There's no where they're getting food from. That's the first bad. These people are separated artificially, I would say, from any sort of society, any sort of culture that they're seemingly from. Strangely, though, this also connects to the second good in the film. You see, this landscape, this canvas on which these people find themselves existing, beautifully communicates in its starkness, in the fact that the wind is forever slapping at your face and there's no refuge from the weather. It's a brilliant setting to have one of the central themes of this time, but also this movie, explored, and that is the fact that people are struggling for meaning and purpose in this barren landscape. This time, this place, in fact, much of Northern Europe was a time when the old ways, the Norse pantheon and the new Christian religion were butting heads, and people were having to negotiate. What did that mean for them in their own lives and their families and their destiny? And what we have is a description of Christianity from one of the Norse elders, along the lines of Christians eat their God. They eat his flesh and drink his blood. He's repelled at the notion of eating a corpse god. It's a fascinating critique and perspective on Christianity, but also as well. We have Christians very much doing their thing as well. One Eye and the boy, they escape their bonds, although I won't spoil how exactly they do that, and they find themselves wandering through the landscape into a valley where they come upon warriors who have stripped naked locals, some Norse, Scottish Norse women and older people, it seems, are sitting in amongst the heath, waiting to be burned, it seems, on a pyre. All through the valley are stakes with banners on which are the Christian cross flapping in the wind. And you have a strong sense that Christianity is really, really knocking heads with people's pagan beliefs. In fact, we also have at this point the boy confronted. Mads Mikkelsen's One Eye is mute, and the boy speaks on their behalf when the warrior says, "Are you Christian?" And he goes, "Yeah." Yeah, totally, yeah, absolutely. They don't believe him for a second, but you have a truth there as well. People at this time were either hedging their bets in terms of what they believed, how they believed it. Supposedly, there was a loophole whereby a pagan might say, "Okay, I will have no god before that god, but then I'll have some other gods behind it, in the background." That was a little loophole. One of the Ten Commandments is, something along the lines of, "You shall not have any god before me." Okay, they say, we'll do that. But they kept on in the background, again, hedging their bets. Maybe they want to trade with other communities or simply want to avoid being persecuted or killed on the highway. And so people would have interesting symbols, like, for example, the Foss Cross, or Fossy Cross, which is a combination of pagan and Christian symbology and reflects this odd time, a fascinating time when old ways were meeting what was to come. Now, this leads to the second bad, however, all of these things that are connected, insomuch as I was quite confused watching this film as to what period of time we're looking at. I thought, watching the film, we must be in the 11th century, because the warriors say that they are crusaders, and I'll come to that in a moment. And there's a weird combination of clothes and weapons, but broadly speaking, I thought, well, the older stuff, the stuff at the beginning of the film where it looks like it's like a 7th, 8th, 9th maybe century sort of sword or vaguely Scandinavian kind of thing going on, Iron Age Scandinavia, in terms of clothes and stuff, contrasts quite sharply with what the warriors, the Christian warriors, are wearing. They're wearing 11th, 12th century stuff, and in fact the weaponry looks old, looks quite early medieval as opposed to Viking or Saxon. So I was confused about what period are we in. Everything's a bit of a mishmash, and I think this reflects the priorities of the filmmaker. And again, I think he was more interested in the themes of the film necessarily than the history. That said, though, once I watched the film, and this is where our third good comes into play, I did some research, some Googling, and came across the fact that actually, very specifically, the film is set in the year 1096 AD, or AD 1096. And that immediately explains lots of the, I suppose, the crusading mentality that I was witnessing. 1096 is the year after 1095, obviously, and in 1095 it was Pope Urban II who called for people to go on the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont. He gave a sermon where the First Crusade was launched, and so I can now see why these warriors are persecuting their fellow Norse Scots, why they're so fervent and so convinced that their violence is necessary and justified, and seemingly they can't wait to start converting and harassing people, so they start at home and and then they plan on going on crusade to the Holy Land. This, though, is where our third bad comes into play. These people, these warriors, who somehow convince One Eye and the boy to come along on the crusade with them, to redeem their souls, as it were, they get horrendously, horribly lost. And this is an unforgivable bad, really, for the film. Because there's no way on earth you're going to sail to the Holy Land from Scotland without having either someone on the boat who knows someone who can get you there. So you just sail down the coast and you pick up Jimmy, and Jimmy will take you the rest of the way. Or you sort of leapfrog, you keep on going along from place to place and people just give you directions as you go. Or without knowing the way yourself. You know, you wouldn't just get in a boat and go, right, we're off to the Holy Land. It wouldn't happen. But in this film, these people get horrendously, woefully lost and find themselves in a strange offshore mist. There's no wind. It's almost like they're in the doldrums, which doesn't really reflect the North Sea or the North Atlantic at all. And I understand, again, this is artistic license. This is almost a passing through the River Styx kind of montage that we witness, where these warriors pass from this realm into some unknown place. But it is historical nonsense. It really is. Sailing south along the coast, the Irish Sea, if you're on that side of Scotland, you know, Wales, Cornwall, the northern French coast, so on and so forth, is entirely doable and relatively safely. Certainly not without wind. So that's a big bad. They got so horribly lost. It's just astonishing. The geography was well known. They would know where the rest of Northern Europe was. So yeah, that's such a shame. Now, this leads, though, to the fourth good. The fourth good in this film is a sudden, sharp, shocking alliteration. Nice. Sudden, sharp, shocking arrowhead, or arrow rather, to the chest. Just this person just screams in the boat. They fall to the floor. They're panicking. All the other men start rowing as quick as they can. They realise that they're in fresh water and seemingly sailing up a river. But this arrow's come out of nowhere, and it's so pleasing to me because this actually reflects a real historical event. This is actually the story, or I think it's based on the story of Thorvald, who was the brother of Leifur Eriksson. These two discovered Vinland, Newfoundland, essentially the Americas, the New World. And Thorvald had the first contact with natives when he was shot by an arrow. He's quoted as saying in the saga of, I think, Eric the Red, "I have been wounded under my arm," he said. "An arrow flew between the edge of the ship and the shield into my armpit," which has got to hurt, hasn't it? Here is the arrow, and this wound will cause my death," he said. Now, I doubt he said exactly that, like, quite so calmly. He probably swore maybe a little bit, but I like that. I like that this, and it is a shock. It's quiet, and then suddenly, ah! This is how these people are given the hint as to where they might be, and I like that it at least touches on a real historical event. That said, though, the very fact that we know that this is a real historical event, the fact that we know the story of Thorvald and the arrow to the armpit, even today we still know that story, is precisely the reason that the fourth bad is brought into sharp focus. You see, our merry band get off the boat and make their way onto the shore, where one of the warriors makes the astonishing observation, incredible acumen on display here, that we don't seem to be in the Holy Land. And then he says, "Where the hell are we?" And initially I was going to forgive this. I was thinking, well, maybe they just don't know that they might be in the New World or in Vinland, that something is over there. It's the year 1096 after all. But it was the year 1096, that's the point. Leifur Eriksson's voyage happened in 999, I think, or 1000 AD. And then by 1010, Thorfinn Karlsefni, I always get that name wrong, Karlsefni, Thorfinn established a colony on Newfoundland for 3 years, 1010 to 1013. And these stories spread like wildfire throughout the Norse communities. People in North Scotland, and also, frankly, elsewhere in Northern Europe, would have heard that something's happened, some new land has been found, and people wanted to know what was there. Even if they didn't necessarily believe the story, they would have had a sense of that story floating around. This is 100 years, well, 96, 97 years after Leif Eriksson's voyage. They should have a sense of possibly where they might be, even if they don't know exactly where that is. I think that's a bad, unfortunately. After all, they have the stone arrowhead that they pull out of their friend who died in the boat. They would have known that that's what happened to Thorvald, or they probably would have heard, watch out, for that kind of activity. They come across curious burial practices, which I'll come back to in a moment. And they really should have a sense of where they might be. The earliest map of Vinland was drawn by Sigurd Stefansson, in my notes, a schoolmaster at Skalholt in Iceland around 1570, and placed Vinland somewhere near Chesapeake Bay or Cape Cod Bay, this kind of thing. There was a communal knowledge. And even if these guys have turned to Christianity, they've come from a community that hasn't been Christian for that long. And even if they are Christian, they'll have contacts with this world and with these people who are talking about what's happening. And for 100 years have been passing on stories of Thorfinn's failed expedition, or the community that couldn't quite hold on in Vinland. I think it's a shame that they didn't have a sense of where they might be. But it is quite cool that our fifth and final good, and this is something that I did have to struggle a little bit to pull out of the, come here, out of the drama. It's quite good that when these guys decide to stay and they have a sense that there are other people in the landscape, obviously one of them's been shot by an arrow, and they found this burial ground, they say, right, we're gonna bring Christianity, and we're gonna convert this place, a new Jerusalem, they say, which is I'm not entirely sold on the dialogue, but it kind of fits with this crusading mentality, but also a sort of post 8th century Anglo-Saxon and British Christian obsession with converting people. There was the Anglo-Saxon mission that sought to start converting people in continental Europe for 300 years prior to when this movie is set, well, 200 or 300 years. So, okay, I can forgive that. But when the good here, that's not the good. The good here is that they start this whole enterprise by, well, possibly making, but certainly drinking wine. Now, this is good because one of the possible etymologies for the word Vinland is Vineland or Wineland. And it seems that Leif and other Norse explorers noted that it was possible to take the berries or even grapes that they came across and turn them into wine. This was possibly one of the reasons for the naming of the place, was the drink. And so it's interesting that these people decide to start off this expedition in a slight state of panic, obviously, but also with a toast by drinking wine. In fact, they drink to excess. It might even be bad wine, in fact. Everyone goes a bit loopy. Some really rather weird, bizarre, and quite dark things happen. I won't describe them, but if you've seen the film, you'll know what I'm talking about. And even One Eye himself, actually, the mute warrior, who's seemingly unbeatable in battle, partakes of this stuff and starts building this weird little tower of stones in the middle of a river. The boy as well actually gets rather drunk. But they start by drinking wine, and whether deliberate or just an echo, on some level, some sort of semi-conscious echo from the writers, I like that. Wine, Wineland, Vinland, Vineland. Okay, it's a good. I'll give it a good. In fact, it's good because it also works artistically. This notion of going to space, going into the unknown, at this point, it feels almost like an away mission, a Star Trek away mission that's gone horribly wrong. These people are in a place where it's life, Jim, but not as we know it, and they've started to hit the bottle. So, yeah, it's a good. The final bad, though, that I'm going to highlight from this film is nothing specific. Even though I wanted to find a specific thing to point out and to highlight, there's nothing specific, but it's also kind of everywhere. It's in the background. It's in the blood of the film. Even though this film is rather bloody, you know what I mean? It's in the DNA of this movie. The director said he's not interested in Vikings or making a Viking movie, and yet he picked one of the most interesting periods in history to explore this clash of cultures, Christianity and the Norse beliefs, Scots and the rest of Europe, the idea of the old and the new world. It's interesting stuff, and yet it's never quite handled authentically, I suppose I would say. The clothes, the weaponry, the attitudes of the people are all a bit of a mishmash. They are simultaneously very pagan, very Viking, very 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, but they're also very 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in terms of, especially, for example, the weaponry. And they turn up in the New World when there's no real precedent for anyone ever turning up there. They're about 90 years odd-ish too late, or 80 years actually from that Lancer Meadows, Newfoundland colony by Thorfinn. There's no real precedent for people turning up at that point in history. It's all just a bit wrong. There's entirely bizarre behaviour on the part of these warriors who yeah, okay, they're fervent and they're religious to a fault. They're downright obsessive in their religion. But they also come apart with the slightest of prodding. The slightest hint that maybe they've passed through the veil and they might be in hell or something like that. It sends them crazy. They drink to excess. They do horrible things to each other and start just to the paranoia sets in. And again, in that sense, it feels like this is not a film about how explorers and warriors and a band of people who are off to fight in a war together would respond. This is not Mars, this is not the moon, this is not another dimension that they've entered. This is just an unknown land. Would they really come apart at the seams like that? I'm not sure. And while, therefore, it's all artistically got merit and it works for that theme, for the stated intention that the director has, it leaves me, as an archaeologist, and for the purposes of this review, from my perspective, this perspective, it leaves me a little bit tepid. I feel a little bit lukewarm having watched it. In fact, on the Facebook page, when I announced that I was reviewing this film this week, having watched it a couple of days ago, it seems to do something similar to lots of people. Either people love it for the artistic impact and the experience, and it is an experience, or they feel as though, to quote one person, it's utter bollocks. And that's where my fifth bad is. It's in that inconsistency. It feels a little bit as though the artist got lost in the metaphor. The director, I'm trying to avoid a metaphor of my own, got lost up his own backside or something. But he certainly knew-ish what he wanted to invoke, but didn't really commit to it either. Didn't commit to the really crazy Martian sort of analogy, nor did he commit to a historical response, or historically grounded response to finding yourself in the new world. After all, Leifr, Thorvald, and Thorfinn didn't go crazy. So, yeah, it's a bit of a bad, sadly. Now, I don't want to end on a downer. I think this movie is worth watching. I'm glad I watched it, in fact, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But some honourable mentions in terms of themes for the film. It's a sad and missed opportunity, really, that One Eye is not a more explicit Odin reference. And even if it's meant to be a subtle reference, Odin, the old father in Norse mythology, gave one of his eyes to gain knowledge and wisdom. And it seems that One Eye, the slave, the warrior, has wisdom and insight. He has visions of what's about to happen. These are denoted by the screen going red. There's lots of weird mirrored sort of imagery where he'll see himself doing things. So he has a vision of himself building a cairn in a river, and then he ends up doing it. So he has this insight, and he has one eye. I feel as though there's something there, Odin, but it's never mentioned, and no one ever brings it up. Even at the beginning, within the pagan society, no one seems to respect that One Eye may be special. They use him, but they don't seem to respect him. I like the way that he handles his axe. Mads Mikkelsen does a great job handling his axe at his belt like a gunslinger. And in that sense, because he's mute and he has no name, he's like the man with no name. He's like a Sergio Leone, so Clint Eastwood kind of Western stereotype in that sense. And I like it. I like that. I like that sensation as well. That sensibility in the film. But ultimately, it's close but no cigar for me. It's not even as violent as I feared it would be. It's not even as gory as the DVD box made out. I suspect this film disappoints so many people because it doesn't quite know what it is. It's not a Viking movie. It's not a gore fest, and it's not a true art house experience. It's a weird mishmash of all three, and I think that's possibly why it splits the audience so frequently. I'm glad I watched it, and again, thank you so much for the opportunity and the excuse to actually sit down and watch this film. I'm glad I own it. I'm more than likely I will watch this film again, probably multiple times to get more from it. But from this perspective, from the Reel World Archaeology perspective, this film is tepid. It feels lukewarm. It's an interesting use of cinematography, landscape, colour, and the texture, the wind, the sound, the economy of language in the film is very interesting. But ultimately, it's lost in its own metaphor, and that's a real shame. Thank you again for this excuse to actually watch it and to get over that mental hump, not wanting to watch this violent film. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this review. Please do comment below. Please do add to the conversation, because obviously I only ever highlight 5 and 5 good, 5 bad. But if there's something else that you want to talk about, please do comment below. For example, the portrayal of native peoples in this film. I'm not wanting to spoil too much, but that's interesting. What happens to a certain crew member, like Star Trek or something, who goes off and comes back? That's interesting in this film. So please do comment below. If there's something that's really spoilerific, put a warning in the comment. As ever, guys, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.